This video has the purpose of demonstrating some of the features of code blocks within TinkerCAD. Many of you are familiar with block coding, and many of you are familiar with TinkerCAD. There's a new feature within TinkerCAD, relatively new, that allows you to put the two together and do block coding within TinkerCAD. So as a way of demonstrating the properties of code blocks in TinkerCAD, I'm going to show a construction of this windmill with spinning blades within TinkerCAD using the code blocks. So I'm going to start up here. When I click on the name, the code blocks dropdown, I can select a new design or I can select an existing design. It tends to give the new designs these funky names like Ingenious Jubilee. Then you can rename it. So I started a new demo, blank demo for the windmill here, and you can click the pencil and change the name of whatever it is that you want. So we'll leave that as windmill demo. So in my first step, I'm going to start by adding an object. So if you look at the top, if you click on the blue shapes here, it shows you all the different shapes you can add. And then if you keep scrolling, you'll get to the modify section, or you can just click on the modify on the left. Some control, some math, some data, and some markup if you wanted to put comments in. So I'm going to start the design with a cone. So you'll just drag the cone shape over into the block coding area. For coding purposes, I'm going to make the coding section a lot larger, and the construction section, the actual 3D model section, smaller. So I've added a cone, and here I can select the color. Windmills tend to be kind of a boring light gray, so I'll stick with that. This allows you to change, this arrow allows you to change some of the features of the cone. So number of sides it's not perfectly circular, so it has to approximate the circular pattern to it, and in this case it's giving it 24 sides to do that. It has a top radius of 0, so it comes to a sharp point, and it has a bottom radius of 10 and a height of 20. So I'm not sure quite what that'll look like, so let's try it. So I'm going to hit the play button. Notice there's a speed here that allows you to see it build in either slow motion or kind of instantaneously. I've got it on the fastest setting for now. We'll play with that later. So it puts a cone here. You'll notice that the cone is centered right in the middle of the plane. So half of it's below ground level and half of it's above ground level. So when I take a look, it's at the origin, and I can tell it's the origin because it's where the 3 axes are. So this red axis is the x-axis, the green axis is the y, and the blue one that's pointing out of the plane is the z-axis. And that'll become useful when we think about it, stretching and moving some of the objects. We'll need to know which axis is which. So again, we've got X in red, Y in green, and Z in blue. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is make this sort of taller and narrower. So I can do that with these features over here, or I can change it this way with the scale modifier. So I use any one of the purple things will allow me to modify the existing objects. So I'm going to leave the X the same, I'm going to leave the Y the same, and I'm just going to stretch the Z by a factor of 4. So this is a multiplier, this number that's in the box. So if I put in 0.5, it'll cut it in half. If I put in a 4, it'll multiply it by 4. And so this will get 4 times taller if I do that. And so let's take a look at that. And that looks good. It's a lot taller and narrower. But again, it's still centered at the origin, and so it's still well below the plane. Most of it's, or half of it's below the plane. So we're going to fix that by using the move modifier, and I'm going to move it up. Well, up is in the positive z direction. This has a height of 80 now because it had a height of 20, and now it has a height. I multiplied it by 4, so that makes it 80. And so if the middle of it is at the ground, and I want it to be the bottom at the ground, I'm going to move it up by 40. And let's try that. And that looks great. So now I've got the base to my windmill. So now I've got the base cone in the right place and the right size. And I'm going to make the sort of head of the windmill. And I'm going to use a paraboloid for this. Now, when you start adding objects, you can attach the next object to the previous object the way I have here. or I can just sort of drop it down here, and it's pretty much going to go from top to bottom. So whether I attach this here or whether I leave it down here really makes no difference in how the program will run. So I'll just attach it because it looks neater. Again, we're going to pick this light boring gray because that's what windmills often are. And I'm going to make the head a little bit smaller than the base because that's pretty typical. So I'm going to make the radius a 5 and the height a 10. And again, I'm going to stick with 24 sides. Let's take a look at what that does. And it's a little hard to see because it's sort of buried under there, and that's fine. Let's move this out so we can see a little better what it looks like. So I'm going to move this out in the X direction by, let's say 50. Remember this base is 10, so that should put us well out here where we can see it pretty easily. So we got the base and then we move it out. So that looks good. Yep, it looks like this it's sort of rounded cone. That looks good. And we'll put the flat part in the back here and then the rounded part in the front and have it moving or pointing in the Y direction here. So in order to do that, I'm going to get rid of this move. And if I want to get rid of it, I just drag it to the trash can. And I'm going to scale it and rotate it. So I'll start by rotating it. I think doesn't make much difference which way I do it. So do I want to rotate it around the X-axis, the Y-axis, or the Z-axis? Well, the X-axis here is the red, and if I rotate around the X-axis, that'll bring the flat part on the bottom of the paraboloid to the back, and then rounded part to the front here. So it'll be pointing in this direction. So that looks like what I want, 90 degrees, and we'll worry about this pivot later. This pivot will be just fine for what we want to accomplish. And then let's play that and see what that looks like. Okay, so now it's pointing in the right direction. We have to make it a whole lot longer. So I'm going to scale that by a factor of 4. And the direction I want to scale it is in this Y direction along the Y-axis. And so let's change this to 4. Again, these are multipliers, so I'll make it 4 times longer in that direction. And it rotates and it stretches out. Okay, that looks good. Now let's see, we can put it up where it's supposed to go. So we're going to have to move it. Remember, this cone is 80 units tall, whatever those units are. So we'll put an 80 in there. Let's see what happens now. So I make the base, I rotate, stretch, and lift. That looks a little unbalanced because the heavy parts in the back and the front and the light parts in the front, and the thing is right in the dead center, which isn't really the center of gravity. So let's move that another 10 so that the point of the cone comes in sort of here. So I'm going to be moving the paraboloid in this direction. Well, that's in the Y direction, but it's in the opposite direction that the axis is pointing. So I'm going to make that a -10 in order to move it the other way. So we stretch that out, lift it up, rotate, stretch it out, lift it up and forward. Now that looks a little better. So now we've got the paraboloid head to the windmill, and now we just have to come up with the blades. So I'm going to want the 3 blades to work together as a unit, and so I'm going to create a new object with them. So you'll notice when we looked at the original, the 3 blades spun together, and I'll show you something about that in a minute. But in order to get them to spin together as a unit, I need to make them into an object. So I made the object, I gave it a real name. I called it blades because those are the windmill blades. You can do that or not. And now in order to build the blades, I'm going to use the wedge object. And again, I'm going to change it to boring gray. And we're going to stretch that way out. So I'm going to do a modify. I'm going to scale that. And so let's scale it 3 in the X direction. And, you can play around with this. This is just what came to me was 0.2, 0.2. So 20% as tall and 20% as thick, but 3 times as long. So we'll do that. We'll get that. and then we'll make that nice and long and thin. So that looks like pretty much like a windmill blade. Now it's at a kind of a funny angle, so where windmill blades are typically at a funny angle, this is not really the angle you would put them at, so that it looks a little bit more like it'll catch wind. I don't know, maybe -30 degrees. You just want something that makes it believable that it's a windmill blade. Let's see how that looks. Yeah, it looks pretty good. Okay, so now it's in all the wrong spots. So we're gonna have to move it again. So we're gonna move that in the positive X direction. So I'm gonna, because it's centered here, I wanna move it out here. So I'm gonna move that. And now I'm gonna make 3 of these, and I want them to be in 3 sort of evenly spaced directions. So we'll go ahead and duplicate this wedge shape 2 more times to get a total of 3 copies. And the only thing we'll change is this last rotation. I want to get one at -120 degrees and one at 0 degrees. So I don't even need the rotation the 3rd time. So I'll go ahead and do that. Okay, so now I've created the other 2 blades. Let's test this out. Reset and play. So we get the base. Now we've got the head. And then we've got blade number 1, spin it around, blade number 2, spin that around, and blade number 3. So now those are all, the 3 blades are now all in the same place together. So now the thing is now you notice when I put this move down here or this scale here, it only applies to the most recently added object. And so if I were going to now try to move these 3 blades up here to the tip of the windmill, I can't do that all at once, right? So in order to accomplish that, you're going to use this select all in object. And so this is where it matters that I use this create new object blades, because now I can select all of the pieces of this object. And now that they're all selected, I can move them together as a unit. So I played around with this a little bit. I need to move it forward, which is going to be in the negative Y direction, and I need to move it up. I know I'm going to need to move it up 80, and I found that -20 in the Y direction looked pretty good. So let's try that. So here's the base, here's the head, and there's blade number 1, spin it, blade number 2, spin it, blade number 3, and now we'll move them, select them all and move them all together as a unit. So now my windmill blades are all in the same spot, and now I can start them spinning. We're going to repeat. I found out by trial and error that it won't allow me to put in more than 200. So rotate. So where am I going to rotate around? What's going to be my pivot point here? Well, I moved the center of the blade to 0, -20, 80. So I'm going to rotate around that point. Let's see. And then how much am I going to rotate by? Let's put it at 10 degrees and rotate it around the y-axis. Let's try that again. Blade number 1, blade number 2, blade number 3, move it up, and now it spins. So notice it's not very smooth movement. What I found, I tried to put it like a small number in here, but then it still paused. So the best way that I got to do it was to put it at the fastest speed and at a really low rotation. So I'll do 1 here. And then it builds very quickly, but then it spins nice and slowly, kind of the way it should. And you can make it spin faster or slower, whatever you want to do. If you want to make it spin for longer, you can add 2 more repeats afterwards. I decided to try to be clever and put a repeat inside of a repeat, and bad things happened. I had to close my browser and restart because it hung up. So it really doesn't want to repeat more than 200 times. So if you want to repeat more than 200 times, you just have to stack repeats one after the other and not one inside the other. So that's the windmill demo. I hope you enjoyed it. You can watch it one more time. And I hope that you find some useful tips in there. And I hope you enjoy using block coding in TinkerCad.